summer of 1966, the United States found itself in a war it couldn't win, against an enemy it didn't understand.
Why must young Americans toil and suffer and sometimes die in such a remote and distant place? The answer, like the war itself, is not an easy one. This is a different kind of war, and there are great stakes in the balance.
For the Americans, it was a war against communism. But for the Vietnamese, it was a war to break free from centuries of foreign oppression. At this pivotal moment in their history, they were led by one man who would stop at nothing to free his people. They called him Uncle Ho. To the rest of the world, he was Ho Chi Minh.
Ho Chi Minh believed in the aphorism that is credited to him: there is nothing more precious than independence and freedom.
He loved the challenge, fighting to achieve his goal. But there are thousands and thousands of Vietnamese, and perhaps Americans and French who don't like him and perhaps detest him, because Ho Chi Minh obviously was responsible for a very bitter struggle that lasted 25 to 30 years.
Millions of Vietnamese would pay the price for Ho Chi Minh's vision of a free Vietnam. A vision that was as bold as it was unbreakable. France, 1919. After 4 crippling years of World War, leaders from the victorious countries gathered at a peace conference at Versailles Palace to discuss the future of a world they had helped tear apart. As the meeting got underway, a shadowy man in a borrowed suit waited in the wings, hoping to be heard. If they were going to discuss a new world order, he had a proposal for the leaders' agenda: liberation for his homeland, Vietnam.
He tries to meet with various people who are vastly above his station. I mean, the very boldness, the self-confidence of this very young man is really extraordinary.
Ho Chi Minh, born Nguyen Sinh Cung, had fled Vietnam in 1911, vowing to return one day to liberate his country from the French, who had colonized Vietnam in the mid-19th century. Ho arrived in Paris and was eking out a living in a series of menial jobs when the peace conference came to town. And although he had no invitation, Ho dared to believe he'd be let in.
Try to imagine this little guy, you know, he really is, he weighed about 85 pounds wet, and he gets dressed up in tails and a top hat and a white tie, and he goes out to Versailles.
He, in effect, wrote an appeal in which he said, you must agree to dismantle the colonial territories and grant independence to peoples such as the peoples of Indochina.
Well, what he got for his effort was a kick in the backside, and nobody paid any attention to him.
France had no intention of giving up its valuable colony. Ho's plea was ignored. But having anointed himself the voice of Vietnamese freedom, Ho refused to back down. After being snubbed at Versailles, he turned his sights eastward, where a Russian revolutionary was also preaching against colonialism.
In 1920, Lenin had come out with a famous strategical plan in which he said that communists, in order to bring about the creation of communist society all around the world, first of all had to destroy capitalism. And in order to destroy capitalism, they had to destroy colonialism.
Ho called Vladimir Lenin's communist philosophy the radiant sun that would illuminate his country's path to victory. In 1920, Ho joined the Communist Party, which funded his efforts for the next several years as he traveled the world, calling for an end to French colonial rule in Vietnam.
We have not only been oppressed and exploited shamelessly, but also tortured pitilessly. We have neither freedom of press nor freedom of speech. We are forced to live in utter ignorance and obscurity because we have no right to study. Such is the treatment inflicted on more than 20 million Vietnamese.
He became very well known throughout the Vietnamese community and, in fact, throughout the foreign affairs community, because this message was not only delivered, it was also printed in some newspapers.
Ho drew praise from the radical fringe back home in Vietnam, who clung to his words as the country's lone hope for liberation. But his message also infuriated the French, who launched a global manhunt to stop Ho from undermining their colonial regime. Ho dodged his pursuers with a handful of disguises and pseudonyms, including Nguyen the Patriot and Nguyen who hates the French.
One of the things that is absolutely critical to the success of Ho's career is that he keeps himself secret. He, after all, has 6 to 10 names, 6 to 7 different birth dates. He is elusive.
But in 1931, Ho's luck ran out. Authorities tracked him down in China, and during a crackdown on political dissidents, Ho was tossed in a Hong Kong jail. Soon after, rumors spread that he had died in prison, and Ho used the confusion to his advantage. When he was eventually released, he slipped away, lowered his profile, and waited for the right moment to re-emerge. (1941). The world was once again at war. France had fallen to the Nazis, and their Vietnam colony was in the hands of Germany's ally, Japan. Ho Chi Minh, now 51 years old and hiding out in a far corner of China, saw France's defeat as the chance he'd been waiting for. In February of 1941, disguised as a journalist, Ho hiked across the vast Chinese countryside and into Vietnam, presenting himself for the first time with the name that would become legend.
He takes this name, Ho Chi Minh, which means he who enlightens. And this is going to be his nom de guerre.
After 30 years in exile from his country, Ho found his reputation had preceded him. Many Vietnamese were ripe for change and had pinned their hopes on the rebel who had tirelessly pled their case. Ho set up camp in a remote area of caves called Pac Bo and began quietly preparing for revolution. First, he would have to defeat the Japanese, then keep the French from coming back. Ho recruited a broad base among those he knew would be critical to his movement's success: peasants.
The peasants in Vietnam is composed of 93% of the population. So if you want to make any revolution, you have to rely on the peasants. Ho Chi Minh was very simple, and he got directly to the hearts of most people. And people believed that he was genuine, and that was very important. He had this kind of personality that was very folksy, and people in Vietnam kind of like that kind of simple, folksy way. And it was no accident that they call him Uncle Ho, because in Vietnam, that means you are part of the family.
Within a year, Uncle Ho had thousands of supporters ready to fight for the nationalist cause. He called his group of rebels the Viet Minh, or League for Independence of Vietnam. For the next 4 years, they trained in guerrilla tactics, scrounged for weapons, and fanned the flames of resistance throughout the Vietnamese countryside. But Ho and his army weren't the only ones hoping to defeat the Japanese. In 1945, intelligence agents from the United States Office of Strategic Services landed in Vietnam to help Ho fight their common foe. The OSS bolstered Ho's supply of crude and stolen artillery with better weapons and ammunition, and they trained the Viet Minh in modern warfare. With his addiction to American cigarettes and near fluent English, Ho quickly befriended his new partners.
Ho Chi Minh was our kind of guy. He could tell jokes, he could smile. He was obviously a patrician. He was a father figure. He was a man of obvious brilliance to the Americans whom he dealt with.
Backed by the OSS, in August of 1945, the Viet Minh drove Japanese occupation forces out of Vietnam. On September 2nd, Japan surrendered, and the war ended with an Allied victory. That same day, the streets of Hanoi surged with hopes of independence, and Ho Chi Minh believed the time had finally come to step in and claim his country.
At that moment, Ho Chi Minh said, we've got to march. Whatever happens, we've got to march right into Hanoi and raise the banner of a new national government. So on the 2nd of September, Ho Chi Minh, dressed in a very simple khaki suit with the little flip-flops, issued that famous speech in which he declared the independence of Vietnam from colonial control.
This immortal statement appeared in the Declaration of Independence of the United States of America in 1776. All men are created equal.
He quotes from the American Declaration of Independence. There's Thomas Jefferson coming out of his mouth.
They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
It was a very clever public relations gambit on his part. He knew that the United States would be a big factor, a major player in Ho Chi Minh's struggle, and he felt that he could appeal to Western idealism.
As the Star-Spangled Banner played in the background, Ho interrupted himself to ask the crowd if they understood him. In response, nearly 1 million of his countrymen exploded in applause.
When that declaration takes place, Ho Chi Minh goes from an obscure figure to a person with perhaps 100% name recognition across all of Vietnam, and he is suddenly transformed into the symbol of Vietnamese nationalism.
Ho had stepped into the power vacuum left by the defeated Japanese. But within just a few months, the world's political climate shifted dramatically. The biggest threat to democracy suddenly went from Hitler's Nazism to Stalin's communism. The United States, led by President Harry Truman, now had a new war to fight, the Cold War.
Should we fail in this fateful hour, the effect will be far-reaching to the West as well as to the East. We must take immediate and resolute action.
Ho's appeals to America's own freedoms couldn't quiet American fear of communism. Ho was a communist, and now he was a threat.
The way they try to depict Vietnam is that Vietnam is part of this great big international communist conspiracy. And there was a slogan that was used at the time, it's called the domino theory, that if Vietnam falls, all the rest of Southeast Asia falls. And so the whole thing gets built up into this tremendous thing about how Vietnam now becomes crucial to all of American policy.
In 1946, America quietly backed a French effort to retake control of their Vietnam colony. As he struggled to maintain his tenuous grip on leadership, Ho had a choice: lose everything he had gained so far, or continue to fight for the freedom he had finally tasted. Ho decided to fight, and so did his people. In December of 1946, the Viet Minh attacked the French at the port of Haiphong, setting off the First Indochina War. The Viet Minh didn't have the strength, money, or air power of their opponents, but they had resolve, courtesy of Uncle Ho, and that made all the difference.
A revolution is fought not by people out of desperation, because if you have no hope, why should you fight? A revolution is fought by people who are hopeful that if they sacrifice, then within 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, or whatever, their children and the children of their children would have a better life. And it's out of a sense of hopefulness that the Vietnamese fought.
Ho relied on his prized military strategist, Vo Nguyen Giap, for combat operations. General Giap coached the Viet Minh in camouflage and ambush, using the terrain to tactical advantage and luring the French into treacherous and tangled jungle. They set booby traps, and when the French were down, the Vietnamese stole their weapons. Weapons supplied by the United States, which bankrolled over 80% of France's combat operations. But for Ho Chi Minh, no challenge was too great. He made struggle admirable. His own image and his seemingly monastic lifestyle set an example for his countrymen.
Leaders who are attempting to be charismatic leaders, whether they're Jesus Christ or Gandhi or Ho Chi Minh, usually claim that they have given up everything for the nation: family, wealth, even sex. And in the case of Ho Chi Minh, he was said to have given up everything for the country.
In turn, Ho demanded unflinching loyalty from the Viet Minh, who, by the thousands, willingly made the ultimate sacrifice.
Ho Chi Minh had a meeting with a French official by the name of Jean Saint-Denis. He said to Saint-Denis, "I will lose 10 men for every one you lose, but in the end I'll win and you'll lose." What he was essentially saying is, I'm prepared to take unlimited losses to fight against the intrusion of the French.
By 1954, with mounting casualties, French public support for the war melted away. But as the French considered how to get out of the war, the Viet Minh figured out how to win it. They made their move at a heavily fortified French military base in a mountainous corridor known as Dien Bien Phu. French forces believed the steep and treacherous terrain provided a natural barricade against attack. But in March of 1954, Viet Minh forces ascended the hillside with their heavy cannons and artillery in tow. They bombarded their opponents day and night in a battle that the French later called 57 Days of Hell. Ho's Viet Minh defied all odds, and as they raised their victory flag at Dien Bien Phu, the French swallowed their embarrassing defeat in a war that was all but over.
After the Battle of Dien Bien Phu and the defeat of the French, it's pretty hard to beat Ho in terms of public opinion. I mean, even anti-communists, had to give him credit, because Ho has got the corner on nationalism. I mean, he is a nationalist hero.
But although Ho could claim victory over France on the battlefield, he still had to face the rest of the world at the bargaining table. In May of 1954, the superpowers assembled for peace talks in Geneva, Switzerland, and Ho's goals were cast aside. After months of tense negotiations, Vietnam was arbitrarily divided along the 17th parallel, splitting it into two distinct countries.
And this was a source of great bitterness on the part of Ho Chi Minh, because he expected, hey, I've done all this independence work, I've fought the battle, my guys have died, and why can't I have the whole country?
Western powers, who held the reins at the peace conference, were never going to give Communist Ho the whole pie. Instead, they gave him North Vietnam. South Vietnam was turned over to a government that promised to uphold United States interests.
And that tells you something again about what happened to the Vietnamese. Ho Chi Minh felt sold out and double-crossed by everybody.
But always pragmatic, Ho strategized that, for the moment, even with only half a country, it was better to rebuild than go on fighting. And though he never abandoned hope for a united Vietnam, Ho plunged into creating a communist society in the North, designed to lift peasants, workers, and the poorest citizens to equal ranks. For the first time in most of their lives, the Vietnamese would have a stake in their own country's wealth.
We're dealing here mainly with a 5-year period from 1954 to 1959. He made a very nice avuncular character, you know, baby kisser, going out to see orphanages and schools and factories and that sort of thing.
For every politician, you have to act in a certain way that you can get the most support from your people. And I'm sure that, you know, part of this simple, folksy image that Ho Chi Minh projected was calculated, but the other thing was also true. It was himself personally.
But no amount of calculation could ensure a perfect road to success. Ho's leadership took a hit when his land reform program spiraled out of control. It was designed to transfer farmland from the wealthy Vietnamese back to the peasants. But it soon turned violent when peasants from Ho's party took revenge against their former landlords.
It became a much more radical land reform program. It not only confiscated the land of the wealthy, many of them were accused of blood debts against the people, and somewhere between perhaps 15 and 45 or 50,000 people were executed.
Though he would later claim not to have known about the killings, terror from the land reform campaign would foster deep and lasting resentment against Ho among many Vietnamese.
I think it's important not to glorify Ho Chi Minh. He gets to be the head of a communist movement. He's not exactly Mr. Nice Guy. But it was very, very hard for his enemies to try to depict him as some kind of a terrible ogre or some sort of terrible dictator. It was always this image of this wispy, foxy little guy, you know, who liked to surround himself with children and, you know, and put on all this act.
It was this image that resonated. To the majority of North Vietnamese, he was still the benevolent Uncle Ho, who had given them their first glimpse of freedom. But the popularity of Ho's communist regime made the United States increasingly uneasy. Ho's comrades in the South had formed the Viet Cong, a guerrilla army that used brutality and coercion in its effort to overthrow South Vietnam's government and reunite the country under communist rule. By 1959, in response to Ho's growing influence, the United States began pouring money, weapons, and support into South Vietnam to bolster the anti-communist cause. America hoped to keep its own military out of the region, but as communist forces gained momentum, the U.S. readied itself for war. Convinced they were both stronger and smarter than the French had been, America planned for a quick and decisive victory. In March of 1965, the first U.S. troops touched down in Da Nang Province, South Vietnam, unleashing a military campaign unlike any they'd done before.
We do not seek the destruction of any government. We do not want an expanding struggle with consequences that no one can foresee.
This is our policy. We're going to wear them down. We're going to kill so many of their forces that they're going to be worn down, and we'll break their morale.
But we will not surrender. And we will not retreat.
What we didn't understand was it was an unwinnable war. Vietnam was unwinnable for us the way it was unwinnable for the French.
But it would take the U.S. another decade to figure that out. By the summer of 1966, nearly 500,000 American troops were committed to the region. But once again, Ho's forces proved that will was mightier than muscle.
People could not figure out, hey, why aren't we winning? I mean, you could take a hill and kill 5,000 enemy troops, and 6 months later, there'd be 5,000 others back on the same hill.
What's going on?
3 years in, the war had descended into chaos. The Vietnamese suffered horrific casualties, and an aging Ho grew increasingly frail. The U.S. continued to decimate Vietnamese forces, but as ghastly images of the dead and wounded made their way onto American television screens, it was clear that no one was winning.
It seems now more certain than ever that the bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate. This summer's almost certain standoff will either end in real give and take negotiations or terrible escalation. And with each escalation, the world comes closer to the brink of cosmic disaster.
In the end, they broke our morale. They wore us down until the American public wanted to get out.
By the late 1960s, widespread American protests called for an end to the Vietnam War and chanted support for Ho Chi Minh. But the iconic leader was no longer at the helm. On September 3, 1969, just shy of his 80th birthday, Ho Chi Minh died, exactly 24 years after he had first proclaimed Vietnamese independence.
After the war, I asked General Giap, how long would you have gone on fighting? And he said 10, 20, 50, 100 years, regardless of losses, until we won. And that's what happened, at tremendous cost.
In 1973, the United States began pulling its forces out of Vietnam in what was seen as a gesture of defeat. 2 years later, Ho Chi Minh's lifelong dream came true. Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, fell, and North and South were reunited under communist rule. "4 million Vietnamese had been killed or wounded in the effort, 17% of their population. This was the price they paid for the dream of a man whose unshakable determination had brought his country independence.